for free trade. So exporting goods, because exporting goods to Mexico are common, so to reduce the tariffs on that trade. So the purpose of it would be to reduce the tariffs on the trade, and what is NAFTA? It'd be the North American Free Trade Agreement. Does anyone have an answer for the second question that they would like to share? All right, I'm not seeing any answers yet, so we'll go ahead and answer this question as well. Free trade that's international trade, and it's meant to just be trade as normal without any tariffs or extra restrictions or quotas or any other policies. So free trade is meant to improve economies around the world by making it a more interconnected economy where you're independent of taxes and tariffs and such. So anybody have an answer for the third question? Now that we know what free trade is, and now that we know what NAFTA is, anybody want to explain what they have on fair trade? Someone said that free trade is without a cost. It is improving economies because it makes it easier to trade and it boosts trade. That's also a very good answer. Any answers for the third question? To answer your question, no, free trade is not just regular trade. There are lots of different types of trade in the world, and that's what we're covering in question 3. How does fair trade differ from free trade? So free trade emphasizes less borders, less tariffs, no restrictions, and fair trade is more about the social aspect, so that all the workers are treated fairly and the human rights are maintained throughout the whole supply chain of producing all these products in fair trade. So the pros and cons of each system, does anyone list a couple pros or cons that they found with each of these systems? In the chat, in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and make sure to leave it up for a second so I can call on you. All right, well, one pro of fair trade is that you're producing a product without any labor exploitation or any human rights violations. So that's one positive, that's one pro of fair trade. But free trade is generally better for companies because it generates more profit. So that's one pro of each system. Anyone want to list their cons for each system? Well, one of the cons of fair trade, when you take into consideration that free trade is better for big corporations, fair trade can be really bad for big corporations because the cost of all these human rights standards and everything can be really, really high, which means that even though you have a higher chance of selling these products, the cost of maintaining it can actually be a lot more, and it can not be good for your company's economy. Does anyone else have any pros or cons of each system they want to share, or answer to any of these 3 questions that they want to share? All right, we can go ahead and move on. So today's overview is we will cover the physical and human geography of Europe and Africa. So this is our table of contents. So first we'll be going over the physical geography of Europe, then the human geography, and then physical and human geography of Africa. All right, so first off, we're going to start with the physical geography of Europe. Here is a physical map of Europe. So we have the Iberian Peninsula down here, the Carpathian Mountains, the Eastern European Plain, Ural Mountains, which if you remember from our first physical geography lesson, serves as one of those land barriers that create natural borders. Scandinavian Mountains with the Scandinavia, and the Kola Peninsula, Iceland, the British Isles, the Caucasus, Balkans, Carpathians, and then all these water systems here. The North Sea, Norwegian Sea, Black Sea, Mediterranean, which is the big one right here. We also have our political map, which we can, we also have our political map right here. We have a legend on the side. All these smaller countries, there's a little guide right here. So you have Monaco, Luxembourg, Belgium, all the way to Kosovo. And then you have Russia, which extends into Asia, and Spain, Portugal, France, the UK, Iceland, and so on. So one of the important things to note about the physical geography of Europe is that it can basically be split into 5 peninsulas. So it's called the Peninsula of Peninsulas. So we have the first peninsula, which is our Balkan Peninsula, which is pointed out right here, Balkan Peninsula. And that's got Greece, Albania, and Macedonia, most notably. And then we have the Apennine Peninsula, which is just Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal over here, Scandinavian Peninsula up here, which is Sweden and Norway, and then the Jutland Peninsula, which is Denmark over here. These are important to remember because they will definitely be coming up on a test or quiz when you take this course. All right, so the first thing we're going to go over is the Alps. So the Alps are the highest and most extensive mountain range system, and it's entirely in Europe. As you can see here, it's around the northwestern border of Italy, extending into France, Germany, and Austria, and it stretches across 8 alpine countries, which is what they call the alpine countries: France, Switzerland, Monaco, Italy, Liechtenstein, Austria, Germany, and Slovenia. So I'll give you a moment to note that down. In addition to just the physical role of being a mountain range, they also have an economic role. So they provide water, hydroelectricity, and a lot of agriculture and recreation. As you know, like a lot of people travel to the Swiss Alps for tourism, for vacations. And so it also has a hotspot of biodiversity. So it's a very very good field for Europe, just economically. It's also got its 4 main climatic influences. So remember, we talked about climate in that first lesson on physical geography. So it has the west, which is a relatively mild wind, moist air of the Atlantic, cold polar air from northern Europe, which we'll go into a little bit more when we talk about Scandinavia, as well as the continental air masses. So the cold and dry in the winter and the hot in the summer, they dominate the east. Now on to the Pyrenees. So the Pyrenees is another mountain range that it separates the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of Europe. Again, another one of those land barriers, and it stretches between Spain and France, and it has a very high elevation. So there's lots of hiking trails, lots of national parks, lots of ski resorts. It's very good for tourism. Again, very good for the economy. And Andorra is a tiny sovereign state, which is in the heart of this chain. It's important to note the location. Location is especially important because, again, that land barrier comes up a lot in the history of the area. So it's a land barrier generally between Spain and Portugal, and so these two countries have they're very separate. Even though they're very close together, they have very separate cultures, language. So they have strong associations with Africa and are generally tied to the sea and the water in the area. The Pyrenees Mountains are also a really old mountain range, and they are not part of the Alps. They're separate from the Alps, so they're a very, very old mountain range, and they extend all the way from the Mediterranean Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. So it covers about 270 miles. And next we have another one of our landforms from the landforms unit. We have a fjord. So a fjord is usually in the Scandinavian area, and it's formed when a glacier cuts a U-shaped valley by ice segregation and abrasion of the surrounding bedrock. So just take a look at the map. Take a look at the map, and you can see all the fjords in the Scandinavian area. So it's an inlet between high cliffs, and it's generally formed by a glaciated valley, so a glacier valley. They're also very popular harbors for ships, again, bringing in that economic aspect. So the ship harbors that you can find in fjords are very good for the economy as well. And so they're a lot deeper than the coastal sea generally. So they are very, very hard to navigate for boaters. They also increase the amount of shoreline in mountain streams. So you have an interface between a mountainous land and ocean. It's hundreds of miles inland. So they can generally be very, very long. And onto the major water systems. So the first of these major water systems is the North Sea. As you can see here, it's bordered by the Jutland Peninsula, a little bit of Scandinavia with Norway over there, the Netherlands, and the UK, and the North Atlantic Ocean on the other side. So it has, it's a sea on the European continental shelf, and it connects to the ocean through the English Channel in the south and the Norwegian Sea in the north. It's very important generally for the Europe's fisheries and all the fishing industry, which again, these economics, a lot of the landforms in this area are very important to the economics of Europe. And it's also a large shipping zone between Europe and the European countries and Europe and the Middle East. It's very shallow and it's quite young compared to some of the other ones, and it was actually formed by the flooding of a landmass. It's also very rich in oil and gas, which we'll see a little bit later. We see that the Arabian Peninsula is also very good for oil and gas, but we also have a little bit of that in Europe and the North Sea. All right, the next one is the Mediterranean Sea. So the Mediterranean Sea, as you know, is that large, large sea right there on the border, bordered by Spain, France, Italy, and some of North Africa and some of the Balkan Peninsula. So it's a very, very important sea because it's been a point of a lot of the Western civilization. So it has a lot of history and it's played a lot of roles in developing shipping, trade, feeding populations, and also has helped mix races and cultures. It also serves as a waterway that links Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And this was very, very important for trade. Ships today use the Suez Canal as a route between Mediterranean and the Red Seas, and the water from the Mediterranean mostly comes from the Atlantic Ocean and the Black Sea. The sea was very, very important again for merchants and travelers of the ancient times. And it helped develop a lot of modern societies that we see today. The last of these water systems is the Danube River. So it's the second longest river in Europe, which is after the Volga River in Russia, and it flows through a lot of Central and Southeastern Europe, as you can see here from the Black Forest into the Black Sea. So it has a lot of economic importance to all the countries that border. You can see here Romania, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Moldova, Serbia, Croatia, all those Eastern European countries. It's very, very important to those Eastern European countries because it's used for a lot of hydroelectricity water supplies and freight transport. And it's also a good source of fresh drinking water for a lot of Central and Eastern Europe. Oh, we have one more. We have the Rhine River. So the Rhine River is also one of the major European rivers. It's sourced in Switzerland and it flows mainly through Germany and the Netherlands and empties into the North Sea that we mentioned before. So the Rhine River is very, very important to Europe, and it's often considered Western Europe's most important waterway because it rises in the Alps, passes through Switzerland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and then it flows into the North Sea, and it serves as basically a highway for all of Europe's freight. It was also important in World War II, so historically there's a lot of importance in the Rhine River because Allied crossings of the Rhine River helped U.S. and British troops to advance into the interior of Germany and bringing about the defeat of the Third Reich. It also holds a lot of importance in the German economy because it can transport agricultural products, coal and oil, and a lot of chemical production. And next we have our climate regions. Our first climate region is the tundra of Iceland. So we can see here we have the tundra and the subpolar oceanic regions. So the Iceland boreal birch forest and the alpine tundra ecoregion covers the island of Iceland in the North Atlantic. So remember when we talked about our tundra ecosystem last time, which has the permafrost, generally very cold, very dry, and we also have the cold northerly climate that prevents a lot of significant crop agriculture. And we talked about that last week as well, how those really extreme temperatures can prevent a lot of economic development in the area because of the weather and because of a lack of crops. The tundra is also very important in terms of the environment because it plays a large role in the temperature of the planet. So the warm air rises from the tropical zone, it's cooled in the tundra, and it sinks back down to the equator. So that causes our weather as well as the air current, as well as the air currents. It also allows for a lot of different species to grow in the area, a lot of animals, a lot of plants. So it's a good factor in the global biodiversity. Our next climate region is Scandinavian. Remember the Scandinavian peninsula. So parts of Scandinavian mountains in Norway and Sweden have that same alpine tundra climate with frigid temperatures, so especially the winter. So in Greenland and Iceland, there is also a northern climate with the cold winters in that area too. I think the last of our climate regions would be a small desert Spain. So take a look at the map on the left. This is small desert Spain. It is within Spain, and it's called the Tabernas Desert. So it's the community that lives in there is the community there is Andalusia. So and typical of most deserts, it is dry and it is very dry and generally hot. So the wet winds coming up from the Mediterranean drop the moisture in the hills. And so because of these mountain ranges that we have in here, there forms a rain shadow, which gives it a very arid desert in the Tabernas. Now on to the human geography of Europe. So first we have our population density of Europe. Oh, hold on, having one moment, just give me 1 second. While I get this fixed, are there any questions over what we've gone over so far? Anybody that needs to go slower, go faster? Are there any problems at all? Anything at all? No? Okay. So we can go ahead and continue into the human geography of Europe. Got it fixed. So first we have the population density of Europe. And we're going to take a look at this population density map and think about that in comparison to the United States. You have in the United States, you have a very, very large land area, and you have certain areas that are very densely populated. If you think about parts of, if you think about cities like New York City or LA or Houston, they're very, very densely populated cities, but not all of America is densely populated. So we're going to compare that to this map right here. I want you to take a look at this map. You can see like compare New York City to something like Oklahoma City, and you have a very, very big difference in population there. And here, that's very different compared to what you see here in Europe, because most of Europe is in that blue, red, red orange zone of population density because of the very small land area and all the developments in that area as well. So a lot of Western civilization was generally centered in Europe, and if you know your history, you would know that a lot of European areas, Europe is generally a lot older than America. So you're gonna have a lot more population density for there compared to America. The next thing we're going to go over is our language family. So if you remember, we had to define language families last week. So we have the Latin, the Germanic, and the Slavic language families. And you can see here in the map, we have all the different languages. We have Russian, and which categorizes the Slavic languages, Belarusian, Ukrainian, Polish, Czech. I see some with a raised hand. Make sure to keep your hand raised if you have a question. Oh, we want one slide back. Okay. And then we have French, Spanish, Italian, which are all the Romance languages. And then we have our Germanic languages like English, Swedish, Norwegian, German, and Icelandic. And they're color coded. I'll give you guys a minute to just take a look at this and note this down. All right. So everyone's ready, we can go ahead and continue. So now for religion, we know that Europe is a big hotspot for religion. So we have Christianity, Catholicism, Orthodox, Christianity, which has three major branches, are Catholicism, Orthodox, and Protestant. And it's the largest religion in Europe. So it's been practiced since the first century, addressed to Christians living in Greece as well as other parts of the Roman Empire. So if you remember your history, that's the origins of Christianity. So Roman Catholics are, as of 2010, were the largest Christian group in Europe. So according to, they were accounting for almost half of the total Christian population in Europe. So we also have the Orthodox, which come in second place, and the Protestants, which are in third most popular. And also Russia is the largest Christian country in Europe by population. We also have a lot of different government structures in Europe. So we have our parliamentary democracies and our constitutional monarchies. So does anyone want to go ahead in the chat, give me an example of a parliamentary democracy? Give you a minute to think about that. An example of a parliamentary democracy, an example of a constitutional monarchy. So we have countries such as a lot of the Central European and Eastern Europeans. We have Croatia, Bulgaria, Belgium are all considered parliamentary democracies, and our constitutional monarchy that we have, which is the most popular constitutional monarchy, is we have Belgium. We also have the UK. As well as the economic structures. So we know the economic structures are very important in Europe, and we talked about how all those landforms really affect the economics of Europe. So the most of the economics of Europe lies in manufacturing and agriculture. So if you think about the Industrial Revolution and how prior to that you had that feudalist system with agriculture, mostly the lords owning a piece of land and the peasants that would work the land. And with the Industrial Revolution, with all that technology, it shifted to a more manufacturing-based economy. As for politics, there's also the Ukraine and Crimea. So the 2014 has a pro-Russian unrest in Ukraine, and you can see here there's a lot of different regions in this area that Ukraine is split into. Some areas controlled by Russia, some occupation of the RSA, some pro-Russian protest, and as well as some armed insurgency. So this was in around 2014, so quite recent. Also important to note is this is a little bit of physical geography, but it's also very important to human geography is the Aral Sea. So the Aral Sea, if you look at this diagram right here, it's dried up almost completely since I believe this is 1966. So since 1966, when it was this full area, and compared to what it is in 2014. So it says right here, it was destroyed mainly as a result of increased salinity, testing of weapons, fertilizer runoffs. So the salinity is very, very high compared to ordinary seawater. Next, we have another environmental disaster, which was the Chernobyl disaster, which was a nuclear disaster occurred on Saturday, the 26th of April, 1986, at a reactor in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which was still part of the Soviet Union at the time, and released a lot of radiation. Some places of Ukraine are still not safe because of the radiation that is still there. So this is important to know, an important event that will definitely show up on your test. A couple more things that are good to note is our Brexit. So Brexit was basically the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union and the European Atomic Energy Community. It's also important to note Catalan independence. Catalan was a small territory within the Iberian Peninsula, and because it was so culturally different from the rest of Spain, they wanted to form their own nation. So. Next up, we're going to get started on Africa. So the physical geography of Africa. Let's see. Make sure to keep your hand up if you are going to raise it, so I can call on you. You can let me know your questions. So here is the physical map of Africa. You can see a lot of the desert area, the tropics of Madagascar, and the water systems that we have in this area, including the Indian Ocean, the South Atlantic, and the North Atlantic on the northern border, as well as the Mediterranean Sea that we just saw in the Europe. We also have the political map here, which has changed in the recent years from most notably South Sudan, and Sudan has now combined into just Sudan, which is one nation. This map includes some of the larger northern nations such as Algeria, Libya, Egypt, and the northwestern nations, which are a lot smaller here, such as the Côte d'Ivoire. Take a moment to note this down. If everyone's got that down, we can go ahead and continue. The first of the major geographical zones of Africa is the transition zone. So it stretches across the widest part of Africa, includes Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Chad, Sudan, Nigeria, and a couple other countries. And it's known as the Sahel, or the border or margin, and it's where the dry, arid conditions of the desert north meet up with the moister region of the lower tropics. And now is the Sahel, which is similar to that same area. It's the ecoclimatic biogeographic realm, which is also the transition zone between the Sahara and the Sudanian savanna to the south. So it has a semi-arid climate, and it stretches between the Atlantic Ocean and the Red Sea. Next, we have the Sahara Desert. So it's a desert on the African continents, mostly in the northern part of Africa, and it serves as one of those land barriers. Again, it's the largest hot desert in the world, the third largest desert overall, and it's smaller only than Antarctica and the northern Arctic. You can see here it almost entirely covers Mauritania, Mali, Morocco, Algeria, Niger, Chad, and Sudan, the northern parts of that, and it almost entirely covers Egypt as well. As well as you see a little bit of Eritrea in the eastern part and Tunisia all the way in that north. As well as the Great Rift Valley. So it's a series of a lot of geographic trenches, and if you remember our plate tectonics is the result of one of those tectonic plate borders, and it runs from the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, which is in Asia, all the way to Mozambique in Southeast Africa. We also have the Nile River, which is a major river of Africa. So it has two major tributaries, the White and the Blue Nile. The White Nile is considered to be Headwaters' primary stream, the Nile, and the Blue Nile is the source of most of the water. So it contains 80% of the water and the silt of the Nile. So the White Nile is longer, rises in the Great Lakes of Africa, and the most distant source is probably located around Rwanda, Burundi, and it flows through Tanzania, Lake Victoria, Uganda, and South Sudan. All right, to just make a correction from before, currently Sudan is split into Sudan and South Sudan. Previously, it was just one nation, which is just Sudan. All right, now for the human geography of Africa. Does anyone have any questions on part 3, which was the physical geography of Africa? Any questions? Anything you're still confused about? All right, if not, then we can go ahead and continue. So we want to talk about religion when we talk about the human geography of Africa. So we have Islam, so the Sunni and Shia Muslims, where the main difference is that Sunni Muslims strongly believe the redemption of human beings is dependent on faith in their God. So belief in the righteous deeds and the mercy of God will determine the redemption of the human beings. Shia Muslims also believe that as a prophet, that just as a prophet is appointed by God alone. So they believe more in the prophets or the caliphs of Islam. And here's a map showing us the different worlds of Islam, what percents of the population are Muslim. Strongly concentrated in Iran, around Kuwait. Oh, this is the percent Shia. Next up, we have the Kurds. So the Kurds are the Kurdish people. They're an Iranian ethnic group, and they are native to a mountainous region of Western Asia, so which is known as Kurdistan. It spans southeastern Turkey, northwestern Iran, northern Iraq, and northern Syria. There's also some other things to take into account here with ISIS and the Arab Spring. So ISIS was the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which is ISIL, or the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which is ISIS, or just the Islamic State, which is IS. And it is a jihadist, militant, and terrorist group. So it operates in Libya, Nigeria, Syria, and a small part of northern Iraq, and it's influenced by an extremist sect of Islam. We also have the Arab Spring, which is a series of anti-government protests, uprisings, armed rebellions that spread across much of the Arab world in the early 2010s. And it was mostly in response to the oppressive regimes in the area, low standards of living, and it began with protests in Tunisia. We also have environmental issues in Africa. So, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, we have indigenous or old growth forests in Africa that are being cut down at a rate of more than 4 million hectares per year, which is twice the world's deforestation average. You also have issues of desertification, where a lot of the lush greenery in Africa is becoming arid, becoming dry, and is becoming a desert. You also have ecotourism as well as poaching, which is removing a lot of the biodiversity from Africa, as well as rapid urbanization in those big cities and some of the extinction of old agricultural practices. And here's a map that shows us an infographic that says Africa is home to 17% of the world's forests. Congo Basin's tropical forest is the second largest in the world, second only to the Amazon, and 65% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa depend on the forest for things like food and fuel, which is the reason that deforestation is affecting so much of the population so badly. We also have OPEC. So this is the mission statement of OPEC. It says that the mission of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, it is to coordinate and unify petroleum policies, ensure the stabilization of oil markets in order to secure an efficient, economic, and regular supply of petroleum to its customers. So here are some of the member countries of OPEC. We have Iraq, Libya, Algeria, Venezuela, Ecuador, Nigeria, Iran, Kuwait, all these other countries around, generally centered around the Middle East and Africa. And it's mostly for, like it says here, the petroleum industry, very important for the petroleum industry. We also have the issue of HIV and AIDS. So the East and the Southern African region is the hardest hit by HIV in the world. So it is home to about only 6.2 of the world population, but over half of the total number of people living with HIV in the world come from this region. So as of 2018, there were 800,000 new HIV infections, which was just under half the global total. Take a minute to note down some of this. And lastly, we have apartheid, which is another one of those social issues that we saw in Africa. So it governed relations between South Africa's white minority and the non-white majority, and it had a lot of racial segregation and political economic discrimination against non-whites. So this was often called a separate development since the 1960s. And it was made possible through the Population Registration Act of 1950, which classified all South Africans by race. It was also supposed to be designed to allow different races to develop on their own, but it forced a lot of Black South Africans into poverty and helplessness. So it was illegal for a Black person to not carry a passbook. They could not marry white people. They could not set up businesses in white areas. So there's a lot of discrimination and segregation as a result of apartheid. As for what caused it, there are a lot of reasons that can be given for apartheid. They're very closely linked. One of the main reasons lies in ideas of racial superiority and fear. So we have, for racial superiority and fear, we have the idea of social Darwinism, which was also developed during this time, which states that, like you think about just regular Darwinism, which is natural selection, that some species are just inherently superior for the environment. And a lot of people believe the same thing with race. So today we went over the physical geography of Europe, the human geography of Europe, the physical geography and human geography of Africa. Are there any questions about what we've gone over so far? Any of the parts we've gone over so far? Any of these four main topics? Any questions at all? You can go ahead, put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, which means we can go ahead and take a look at next week's homework. So your homework for next week is to write a paragraph explaining what OPEC is, its significance to the global economy, and how it has fostered neocolonialism in the Arab Peninsula. Which are all things we went over, and we want to really go in depth and explain that next week. So if you have any big questions about any of this stuff that's going to be on the homework, you can go ahead and ask them, and we can go over OPEC and all those parts again. Does anyone have any questions? We're going to go ahead and review OPEC since it's going to be on the homework, and I just want you to get a proper idea of what OPEC is about. So going back to this map of OPEC, countries in OPEC and the OPEC mission statement. So it created the Baghdad Conference in September of 1960 by Iran, Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. So they were later joined by Qatar and a few other countries such as the UAE. So its objective was to just unify all those petroleum policies in member countries and basically provide increase the petroleum industry for all these countries around the world. So its formation by these five really big oil producing countries occurred at a time where the international economy and the political landscape was really changing with a lot of decolonization, a lot of new independent states in the area, and it was largely separate from the Soviet Union at the time. So the member countries took a lot of control over their domestic oil, but once OPEC was formed, they began to collaborate in the petroleum industry. So in recent events in 2020 with the outbreak of COVID-19, it had a really bad impact on both the world economy and the energy sector. So these OPEC nations had to take a lot of measures to slow the spread of the virus, counter its effects, and also make sure that the economy could deal with these issues as well. So the oil market saw a very, very large decrease in demand, and global storage was filling really quickly. There was a lot of volatility, and that propelled OPEC and its partners to intensify their collaborative efforts so they could really stabilize the oil industry. So there were a lot of new members, new organizations. So including the G20 energy ministers, which were Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Norway, the African Petroleum Producers Organization, the International Energy Agency, the International Energy Forum, and a lot of independent producers. So in the September of 2020, OPEC had been going on for 60 years. So now we've reviewed OPEC. Any other questions on what we're going over, what we went over this class? Any questions on the global economy? Any questions on neocolonialism or the Arab Peninsula? Right, I got a question about neocolonialism. So neocolonialism is basically imperialism. So if you think about the closest analogy would be sort of America during the American Revolution and its relationship with Great Britain, and how America was greatly reliant on Great Britain because Great Britain had colonized the area. It was governed by Great Britain. The economy was based on Great Britain. And that's the sort of the same thing that you see with neocolonialism. Neocolonialism is colonialism, but in the present day, and it's sometimes, a lot of the time, not necessarily as overt. So in this case, a lot of neocolonialism, because of the economy, is a smaller country has one very specific industry that they make a lot of money off of. And when another larger country, such as the US, comes in, takes over that industry, becomes the main consumer of that industry, it creates basically a one-way economy of that country. And if the US were to stop buying that product or buying that service, then the economy of that smaller country would collapse. So that's basically the big problem with neocolonialism and the economy in general. The Arab Peninsula would be countries like Yemen, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. In our OPEC map, we saw that a lot of these countries in the Arabian Peninsula are part of OPEC. All right, are there any other questions about what we're going over this week? What we'll be going over? What's on the homework for next week? Human geography, any maps want me to revisit? Oh, okay, yeah, I can go back to the physical map of Europe. Okay. Here is the physical map of Europe. Just take a look at it again. We have the Pyrenees Mountains, the Alps, the Ural Mountains, which we'll be going over a lot when in our Asia unit for land barriers. The Caucasus here as well, Carpathians. Yeah, and our 5 peninsulas, the arguably the most important part of the physical geography of Europe. These 5 peninsulas, because a lot of this is basically based on the climate of the areas as well as the culture and economy. So we have again our Balkan Peninsula, which contains Greece, Albania, Macedonia, the Apennine Peninsula, which is just Italy, the Iberian Peninsula with Spain and Portugal, Scandinavian Peninsula, Sweden and Norway, and the Jutland Peninsula, which is Denmark. And remember, we have that land barrier over here with the Pyrenees Mountains, it separates Spain and Portugal from France, which even though they're close, very, very close together, it is that land barrier that prevents people and cultures from moving across and making the culture into one. So, Spain and France, very, very different, and they have more connections through colonization in later years in Africa than they do through Europe. All right, back to the homework. Are there any other questions at all? Does anyone want to write down the homework? Any other slides you want to revisit? All right, if there is nothing, thank you guys for coming, and I'll see you next week.